The Constitutional Court here has called on the government to draw up a tangible action plan to tackle climate change up until 2049 in a ruling that extends some victory to climate advocates who claim failure to reduce emissions more effectively is a violation of their rights. We have more on Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Thursday, October 24th here in South Korea, where the first climate litigation ruling in Asia was recently shared. For more on this event, I have our panel of foreign media members. I have Chloe Borgnon, a correspondent for French broadcaster France 24. Chloe, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Thomas Maresca, a correspondent for American news agency UPI. Thomas, it's good to have you here.
Thanks, great to be here.
Right, Chloe, let's start with details of the latest development related to climate action here in South Korea. What was the gist of the European media coverage?
Yeah, so it's been something that's been done in end of August. So the top Seoul court gave a judgment saying that climate laws are not considered sufficient. Therefore, it was considered that it's an infringement on basic human rights. So we might come back on more of the details later. But what's interesting to see is that there were 2 points that really were discussed by foreign medias. First one was the fact that it's a landmark ruling. So it's a climate being a fundamental right. It's the first time that it's said in Asia. It's one of the first also, you have been a bit of the same kind of court trials in Europe, a bit in the US, but it's important to know that it is a landmark and it is a first, and that's a part of what the media have been covering. The other thing is really the surprise concerning the age of the plaintiff, because it was done through a petition that was mostly signed by infants at the time. So in 2020, most of them were 5 years old or less. So I mean that now they're not grown-ups either, and it was quite impressive for the foreign media to see these young activists, like young climate activists that are 10, 11 years old now, and they are yet still very young, but yet very active in their fights for climate justice.
Right, and was their age also covered by the American media, Thomas? I mean, what was the gist of the coverage by the American media?
Right, I would say it was not probably too different than the way Europe covered it. You know, it was also hailed as groundbreaking and kind of framed as the first one in Asia, and you know, what might this mean for other countries in Asia that also have similar legislation or litigation pending. You know, I think maybe compared to Europe, some of the context, you know, there have been some cases that were successful in Europe along the similar lines of these kind of human rights type litigation violations. So I saw some US articles kind of referencing those, less so about, I mean, there are also similar cases that have been working their way through the court system in the United States, but there haven't been really like a successful one like we've seen here or in, you know, Europe, like in Germany, there was a successful one, and in Switzerland, similar. So, I mean, I think it's a little bit framed along those lines, less in terms of how it reflects what's going on in the U.S., I think, in you know, that, at least from what I saw. But yeah, as well, the youth of the plaintiffs. I mean, it's a common thread among some of these. There is a well-known case in the U.S. that's been ongoing since like 2015 that started with, you know, it's about 20 people, but the main plaintiff was like 15 when the case started, and it's just been working through the system. It's still ongoing. I think it just was rejected again by an appeals court, and they're trying to take it back to the Supreme Court. This is now she's like 27 years old or something like that. So there are, you know, parallel type of cases, but there hasn't been, you know, a success like this has been. So I think that's, you know, also a focus of the coverage.
Right, the ruling here in South Korea has been in favor of the climate advocates, which is why it has been making a bit of international headlines. And for the sake of clarity then, Chloe, could you tell us a bit more about the demands made by the plaintiffs and of course the actual court ruling?
Yeah, sure. So as I was saying, that was in 2020. There was a petition that was done. The arguments that were given by the plaintiffs was that according to them, the government, the South Korean government, was not doing enough against climate change, and because of that, the government was violating their human rights. They were also saying, especially the youngest one, that their generation is at risk of more climate change crisis. And also, the other thing they're saying is that it's not fair, because they will be the one who will have to suffer the burden of being more strong in their legislation themselves, because what we're not doing now to limit, like to reduce gas emission, will have to be done like tenfold in the future. So that's what they were saying, and that's something we can see in one of the quotations from one of the plaintiffs, who is now 12 years old, and she was saying that she has the right to live happily and safely. So regarding the court's ruling itself, as we said, it was successful, and it agreed with the plaintiffs. The court is saying that the existing laws on emission targets are not conform with the South Korean constitution. They are saying that by not doing enough, the government is in violation of its duty to protect basic rights, and it fails to protect the future generation as well. So what exactly in the Constitution were they pinpointing is this part where saying that the citizens have the right to live in a healthy and pleasant environment. And so now the government and the parliament, they have to come up with a new law regarding the emission of gas emissions by Carbon Neutrality Act would have to be changed by the end of February 2026.
Right. And for some better perspective, Thomas, what can you tell us about the Union administration's efforts to reduce emission, and what are your takeaways?
Right. Well, I mean, just even to follow back a little bit about the coverage of this case, one other thing that I think was mentioned in most coverage was that South Korea still does not have a great record on, environmental protections. And even with this landmark legislation, it's not changing the 2030 target. It's only applying to the next phase from 2031 to 2050. So I think, that's also a voice in this. It's a win for sure, but there is some both skepticism about how this will actually, come out in practice, and also just the idea that Korea still is lagging in a lot of ways, even some of its other, developed counterparts in its roadmap forward. So as far as the Yoon administration in particular, there have been some changes from the previous administration, not so much with the reduction targets, but the ways to get there. I mean, the biggest thing is that Yoon's administration in 2023 released their own, there's like the 10th electricity plan, and it changed the formula for how to just the sort of composition of where the energy is coming from in the country, bringing nuclear power back in, whereas the previous administration had decided to phase it out and not really include it, and to aim for 100% renewables. The Yoon administration changed the formula. It's something by 2030, the goal is nuclear to have almost 33% of the pie, increase renewables to 21.6, but it was going to be 30% before that. Coal is still a big issue, and the big part of the Korean energy menu, so that's around 21%. And this administration will extend the life of 10 nuclear plants that previously had been scheduled to be phased out, and also reduce the level of industrial emissions. It was going to be down to or reduce it by 11.4% instead of it was going to be 14.5%. So, we can see that nuclear energy in general is a bigger part of this administration's even foreign, export policy. There have been some nuclear reactor sales and programs going on, and so that's that's probably the most significant, change. But also this administration also kind of reflecting a more international focus in a way, and especially a closeness with the U.S. I think they've worked that into the formula as well, in terms of just at least discussing things from, cooperation, bilateral financing agreements, supply chain resiliency types of efforts with the U.S., and looking to leverage some of this like Green Climate Fund, Green Global Growth Institute, which are actually international groups both based in Seoul, and maybe use kind of buy carbon offsets to reduce the overall emissions portfolio. But the critiques are that nuclear energy is more expensive, requires more safety precautions, and is not really renewable is the preferred way forward, I think, for most of the climate community. And just in a very broad way, to speak back to the earlier point, if you look at the Climate Action Tracker, which is sort of one of the main independent bodies to evaluate different countries, Korea is rated as highly insufficient still, its plans, and their evaluation was that Korea really needed to be targeting a 59% reduction by 2030 in its emissions. Now, 40 is the current standard, to be on track to reach the Paris Agreement 1.5 Celsius limit. So far behind that. And I think the general climate community's evaluation is that Korea still needs to do more.
Right, which is why perhaps the Constitutional Court, as you mentioned, has called for a stronger effort, climate action, by the year 2026 February, you were saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Chloe, do you suppose this latest court ruling would serve to perhaps build greater momentum for climate action within the government itself as well as the public here?
Well, we could also, because as we said before, all the foreign media, all the press is looking at South Korea, saying this is a landmark, this is a first. So it's obviously a bit of pressure, of international pressure. There is a few points where you can say it might build up a momentum. First thing is the Ministry of Environment say that they support the decision and they plan to get follow-ups to get into motion and to get the plans in time. That's already a good thing that the ministry is agreeing with what has been decided. The other thing is also for the very young generation of activists, it's quite rewarding for them to think that their action are working and they are getting things done, because we've seen quite a lot of trials, like we were speaking about the US, where young activists are not getting to the end. It's been rejected and rejected and rejected. Here, at least, they can see that it can work. So that's the positive of it. Yet, will it be enough? That's the thing. Like, I'm a bit of a pessimistic maybe here, but if I take the example of France, France was in a bit of a similar situation. In 2021, there was one trial where the French government was considered as not doing enough regarding the gas emission. It was quite followed because it was done by big organizations, also like big YouTubers have been promoting this trial. So it was quite a big sensation in France, but still the deadline was at the end of 2022 and nothing was done. And still now there's no impactful changes, because that's the thing with climate change regulation, is that you need the will of the population and the will of the government to get things to move. So that's the hardest part, I will say.
Right. But staying with the will of the public, Thomas, based on your observation of the members of the public here in South Korea, do you suppose that more can be done to raise broader awareness about the need for individual action and participation in the fight against climate change?
Sure. I mean, I think it can be done, more can be done everywhere. I think in Korea, Korea's unique in some ways in that, when you just look at the development and the incredible speed at which, Korea went from the end of the war to industrialization, modernization. I mean, it's so rapid that it's almost incredible to be trying to reverse it so quickly. And I think in some ways that mentality may not have sunk in as much, especially perhaps with older generations. I think when you look at places like Europe, I get the sense it's more kind of in the atmosphere, thinking about individual, in the Netherlands, everyone's riding their bike to work, or, I think there's just a kind of a consciousness of sustainability or ethical consumerism. And I mean, that's definitely happening here. I mean, this case, that we've been speaking about, the Constitutional Court case, I mean, that really did come from a grassroots effort and you can see the younger generations are a lot more active and loud about it. I mean, just last month, there was a 30,000 person demonstration for climate in Gangnam, actually, and that's been happening for the last couple of years, and that's growing. I did a story a couple of years ago about a senior citizen, environmental rights group, that was interesting to see that's happening. So I think it's like many things in Korea, you can see it's happening quite quickly as well, but sure, there can be more stuff. I mean, the one thing I guess I was thinking about was Korea also has this unique, incredible soft culture power and, something like K-pop fandom. And there's actually is a group called K-pop for Planet that has been an activist group, maybe you've covered it. And that's something that's kind of unique, and you can almost see how that could be a powerful tool to just leverage the fandom. And we've seen the K-pop global fandom be activists in some cases, like the Black Lives Matter movement. And even here, they had a case where they were protesting Hyundai having a contract that was with involved like an Indonesian coal-powered plant, and eventually Hyundai withdrew from the contract. And they've had some stuff just in terms of trying to make the K-pop industry itself more eco-friendly, like reducing the amount of plastic collectibles and things like that. You'll see people lining up to buy 4 different copies of a disc because there might be a different collectible card in it, and so going more to digital downloads, and even saying K-pop artists have the power to demand maybe more renewable energy in their concerts. And, of course, they have a huge platform. I mean, there have been some. Blackpink recorded a message ahead of one of the COP events, and, BTS has had some environmental statements, and they wore upcycled clothing to a UN event. So, I mean, you can see that, but you could also see there's a lot more that can be maybe done with that platform that also links up globally, because it's kind of a uniquely powerful thing that Korea has. So that's
right,
one
for sure.
thought. Yeah.
For sure. Chloe, beyond borders then, could you tell us a bit about the first ever climate case triumph, I believe, at the European Court of Human Rights, which came earlier this year, I suppose, right?
Yeah, right. So it was in April in Switzerland. And so it was done by the European Court of Human Rights. So that's the highest European court on the matter. The ruling was saying that, a bit like Korea actually, Switzerland had failed to comply with its duty to combat climate change and meet emission targets. And they more specifically say that they were violating the women's rights. So why the women? Because the plaintiffs were actually a group of women, of elderly women. It's called the Senior Women for Climate Protection. Their average age is 74 years old. And what they were saying is that older women are more at risk with the high heat and the heat waves that are more and more frequent, so they are more at risk with the climate change. And that's kind of what they got from the court rule. What's interesting to see is the broader implication, actually, especially for Europe, because this court is ruling for Europe and is making rules that can be applied in the rest of Europe. And so what it's saying is that countries must better protect their people against the change that are the consequences of climate change, and that it is a fundamental right for a healthy climate and protection by the state regarding those crises. So it can have consequences in all of Europe because of that. And there were some trials that wanted to go on in Portugal and in France, but they were abandoned because paperworks, basically. But it's interesting to see that now they could try again because there's this new legislation for jurisdiction for Europe. But it still has its limit again, because what the court said, because it's not national court. So what they said is it's up to the Swiss government to take action now. So there was obviously no binding from the European court on this subject.
And in the meantime, though, Thomas, quite a number of pundits believe that there has been a remarkable surge in the number of climate lawsuits in recent times. How do you explain this phenomenon?
Yes, there have. It's kind of a snowball effect is the way I've seen it described. There was one study by Oxford University Environmental Change Institute that said 800 climate litigation cases were filed between 1986 and 2014, and there's been 1,000 since then. And the reasons, there's a few reasons that I've seen sort of cited. One is just that some of these cases have been in the works for a long time, and we're starting to just get some of the rulings in recent years. And the more cases that are successful, the more that sort of builds momentum to file new ones. As well, obviously public opinion has changed a lot about just the danger and the reality of how important climate change is, and that definitely affects how laws and litigation plays out. I mean, when you look at things like, in the US legalizing gay marriage or something like decriminalizing marijuana, those kind of, the laws seem to follow the public opinion about the matter, and so that's definitely been happening with climate. And I think, a big factor is just also the science has gotten so much stronger, more precise. I mean, the evidence, just the evidence that climate change is human caused is so much more irrefutable, even in just sort of recent years, that it makes it easier to bring cases and, makes it easier for judges or to rule on those. And then there's also been, not just in terms of rights cases, but all different areas in sort of litigation. And there's some there's a lot of liability and fraud cases against private companies like oil companies. And one thing that's propelling those is that it's called attribution science, the ability to really link specific extreme weather events to, the man-made climate changes. It's become so much finer. You can actually kind of quantify it, say this definitely happened because of this, and maybe, quantify the damage. And that's propelling a whole new wave of these types of cases where you can really bring kind of evidence in a way that's scientifically based. So I think that's part of it. And then the whole industry is really, there's even been a criminal lawsuits in France against Total Energy that was filed as a criminal case against them. So a lot of these still haven't really broken through. I mean, we're seeing these little wins, but there's a lot that are in the works, and small maybe rulings here and there. But I think this is just a field. I don't think anyone thinks, this is going to solve everything, but it's definitely a really growing field of sort of, part of the puzzle.
Right. And moving forward, Chloe, this year's UN conference on climate change takes place in Azerbaijan next month, I believe. Could you briefly tell us about the agenda? We have about a minute left.
Sure, so I'll go really quickly. So the COP29 will have three main points on the agenda. First thing is, it's been named the Finance COP because the main thing to do will be to get a new collective quantified climate finance goal. So that means just a fund funded by most of the developed countries to help the developing countries. It's the first time in 15 years that it's going to be renegotiated. It was done in 2009, and it has to be done again because the money that is being put on by the developed countries every year is not enough anymore because the crises are getting stronger and stronger. Second point will be to account for the priorities and the necessities of developing countries. They are a bit scared that they still have to, their agenda has to be adjusted to them and to their needs. So that's one of the big points also of this COP in Baku. And the last point is obviously the main objective that remains is to keep the temperature rising under the 1.5 Celsius degrees. That was the main goal. And so for that, there is a need for stronger climate commitments. So let's hope it happens at this COP.
Fingers crossed for that.
Exactly.
All right, Chloe, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Thomas, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends Press Perspective for today. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.